Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth says Ukraine's goal of taking back all its territory is unrealistic. Hegseth met with Ukraine's defense minister at a NATO summit in Brussels, laying out the Trump administration's plan for peace. He says the war must end and that President Trump intends to do that by bringing Russia and Ukraine to the table.
We will only end this devastating war and establish a durable peace by coupling allied strength with a realistic assessment of the battlefield. We want, like you, a sovereign and prosperous Ukraine. But we must start by recognizing that returning to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders is an unrealistic objective. Chasing this illusionary goal will only prolong the war and cause more suffering. A durable peace for Ukraine must include robust security guarantees to ensure that the war will not begin again. This must not be Minsk 3.0.
And let's bring in senior Pentagon reporter Luis Martinez, ABC News national security and defense analyst Mick Mulroy for more. Louis, how different is this from the Biden administration's approach to Ukraine?
Diane, this is a very clear message about the United States, the Trump administration's plans for Ukraine and how to get to a negotiated settlement. The Biden administration had been very clear that all of the military aid that they're providing was to provide the strength so that Ukraine could have leverage at the negotiating table. But they ultimately said that it was going to be up to Ukraine to decide for itself how far it wanted to go in terms of the talks and how far it wanted to go in terms of giving back territory or giving away some of the territory that had been seized in this current conflict. But that's the way it had always been. The Biden administration kind of leaving it in Ukraine's hands. And most recently, just this week, we heard Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, say that potentially a give and take in terms of the Ukrainian seized territory in Kursk, that Russian province, could give way to maybe an exchange of some of the Russian territory that was seized over the last 2 years, but he didn't specify how. But again, very clear cut, as clear as it can get actually from the United States, as the Trump administration's defense secretary outlines that it's just not going to happen, that it is an unrealistic goal, which, by the way, officials during the Biden administration had acknowledged was not realistic either, but they didn't say it publicly, as Defense Secretary Hegseth has said today.
So, Mick, do you also agree that Ukraine retaking Crimea and its other territories is unrealistic? And how could the Defense Secretary saying this out loud, publicly this way, impact potential peace talks?
So, Diane, as Louis said, this has been something that's been known by most defense experts, including the last administration, and now being said by the current administration, that militarily, although the Ukrainian military has performed superior over the Russian military, they are just vastly outnumbered. So the idea that they could take all this territory back militarily is very difficult to see, unfortunately. So there is a reason for Ukraine to look at this Kellogg plan, this plan for a negotiated freezing of the conflict, as something that's in their interest. So I think Secretary Hegseth is saying something that hasn't been said, as Louis said, out loud, but he's saying something that most know is true. It's very difficult to see how they can militarily take back, especially with countries like North Korea providing soldiers an almost endless supply of artillery. This could be something that is in Ukraine's interest, and ultimately they get a say. They're part of the two-part negotiations that would come to a settlement, and whether they agree with this.
So, Mick, could this speed up negotiations if Ukraine is able to come to that place?
It could, and quite frankly, it looks like now the problem with this is Russia. President Zelensky has essentially said that many of these components of this agreement could be something acceptable to Ukraine. They haven't committed, of course, because they haven't even really started the negotiations. But the biggest impediment seems to be President Putin and Russia, which shows that this is something that might be more in line with the interests of Ukraine. And hopefully the United States lines up squarely behind Ukraine. As Secretary Hegseth said, they want to see a free and prosperous Ukraine. And this does not, even though it's frozen, it does not require that Ukraine give away any territory. They just stop the fighting, essentially, which would allow Ukraine to refit and essentially rearm and prepare if this ceasefire should ever break.
Louis, how are NATO allies responding to this?
And there was an almost immediate response because sitting right to his left was Britain's Defense Secretary, who was chairing this meeting of Ukraine, the 50 countries that are supporting Ukraine militarily. And what he said is, we hear you. He said it directly to Hegseth, and it seemed to me that these were unscripted remarks. He said, we hear you. We understand what you're saying with regards to the European countries providing and stepping up more aid to Ukraine. And he also talked about how we hear you when you commit to NATO and to Article 5. And that's the self-defense article that's very key that involves the United States in the self-defense of Europe if something happens over there to one of the NATO allies. But at the same time, he said that moving forward, they understand his comments, and it was almost an immediate reaction, immediately right after Hegseth finished his remarks.
All right, Mick Mulroy, Luis Martinez, thank you both.